Hello boys and girls. In this video, I'll be talking to you about benchmark fractions, or as I call them, the famous fractions. Fractions to remember, like 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, and a few others. We'll talk about their decimal equivalents, their percentages, and equivalent fractions for each. During the video, please have your notebook open and a calculator handy. Feel free to pause at any time to take notes or to check my arithmetic. When working with fractions, I like to start with a number line. And so here's a basic number line between 0 and 1. On it, we're going to place some of the benchmark fractions. The most famous of them all is 1/2. And as you can see, 1/2 is halfway between 0 and 1. 1/2 is often used to make comparisons. Here are some other benchmark fractions. We can compare 1/3 to 1/2. 1/3 is less than 1/2 because it's closer to 0. Likewise, 2/3 is greater than 1/2 because it is closer to 1. Let me add the fourths to our number line. One of the things that I noticed right away is that 2/4 is at the same place as 1/2. Well, they're equivalent fractions, so that makes sense they would be located at the same place. But I can also see other comparisons. 1/4 is less than 1/3, and 3/4 is greater than 2/3. If you memorize and visualize this number line, this will help you in the future without having to calculate each and every time. You'll know the answers when comparing fractions. Let's look at each one in more detail. We'll start with the halves. Since we're talking about only the values between 0 and 1, the only halves that we'll talk about here are 0/2, 1/2, and 2/2. First, we'll talk about their decimal equivalents. Using your calculator, type in 0 divided by 2. The quotient is 0. Well, we could have done that in our heads. Let's try 1 divided by 2. The quotient is 0.5 or 5/10. And then again, 2 divided by 2 is 1. Again, we could have done that mentally. We know that any fraction whose numerator and denominator are the same number is equal to 1. And so you probably have already memorized these values. Let's move on to other equivalent fractions. For 0/2, I could list quite a few. They all have 0 in the numerator, and the denominators are all multiples of 2. If you need to, you can check the math. They will all divide and equal 0. If I continued making equivalent fractions, I could make one whose denominator would be 100, and it would look like this. 0/100 equals 0%. I think for the remainder of this video, we can ignore all of the 0 fractions. It's obvious that any fraction whose numerator is 0 will be equivalent to 0, or 0%. And so we don't need to investigate this any further. Let's move on to 1/2. Here are a few equivalent fractions for 1/2. If you want to, pause this video and do the division. I'm sure you'll agree they all equal 0.5 or 5/10. If I continued to make equivalent fractions, I could make one whose denominator is 100, and it would be 50 over 100, which is equal to 50%. This reminds me of a TV commercial I saw this morning. Carpet Emporium is having a sale, 50% off padding, 50% off carpet, 50% off installation. And later in the commercial, they showed half off all prices. And so the benchmark fraction 1/2 is one you will see time and time again. Memorize it, understand it, and know it. And finally, 2/2. Here are a few equivalent fractions. Obviously, I could make one whose denominator is 100. It would be 100 over 100, or 100%. Easy. Memorize all of the equivalent fractions here and you will be set for life. Now let's talk about the thirds. The thirds are kind of funny. Oh, and by the way, notice I didn't list 0 thirds because we know that would be equivalent to 0 and the percentage would be 0%. So let's start with 1/3. When you divide 1 by 3, your answer will look like this. 0.3333, as many 3's that will fit on your calculator. To show this repeating decimal, I'm going to use a bar above my 3 to show that it is a repeating decimal and it did not round off or truncate to a whole number. This is going to come up again, so understand how I use the bar. Some of my equivalent fractions are as follows. If you'd like to pause this video and do the division, you'll find that all of the quotients are repeating decimals of 0.33333. Notice too that my equivalent fractions all have denominators that are multiples of 3. Since 100 is not a multiple of 3, creating the equivalent fraction whose denominator is 100 looks a little strange. It would look like this. 33.33333 all over 100. Sometimes people will round the numerator to the nearest whole number and say that 1/3 is equivalent to 33%. If you want to be exact, you would say 33 1/3%. But for today, we'll leave it at 33%. Just understand that to be exact, you would say 33 1/3%. Now we'll divide 2/3. You will notice it is also a repeating decimal. 0.66666, as many sixes as your calculator will display. And so to show that, I have a bar over the 6 to show that it is a repeating decimal. Here are a few equivalent fractions. Feel free to divide to make sure that I've listed them correctly. And again, my denominators are all multiples of 3. 100 is not a multiple of 3, and so my equivalent fraction looks a little strange. It would be 66.666666 all over 100. I like to round to the nearest whole percentage, and so that would be 67%. But if you were going to be exact, you would say 66 2/3%. And now I'll do the last third, 3/3. Divide, easy, that's 1. Equivalent fractions. And here is the equivalent fraction in terms of its percentage. 99.99999 over 100, or if I round to the nearest whole percentage, 100%. Notice how the percentages on the right get larger for each third until they are eventually at 100%. 33% plus 67% equals 100%. We could say the same for the decimal equivalents. If I added 0.33333 plus 0.66666, my sum would be 0.999999, or rounded to the nearest whole number, it would be 1. Just an interesting pattern I'd like you to note. And at this point, I'm also going to tell you that for the remainder of the video, we're not even going to consider fractions that are equivalent to 1, because all fractions whose numerators and denominators are the same will be equivalent to 1, which is equal to 100%. And so when we talk about the fourths, let's talk about just 1/4, 2/4, and 3/4. We know that 0/4 is 0. We know that 4/4 is 1. And so let's focus just on 1/4. We do the division. We have 0.25. That reminds me of a quarter, 25 cents. In fact, some people call 1/4 1/4. Here are some equivalent fractions, all equal to 1/4. Stop this video and do the division, and you'll see the decimal equivalents for each is 0 and 25/100ths. Well, that makes me think of its equivalent fraction whose denominator equals 100, 25/100ths, which is 25%. I think we can go through this very quickly. Let's go to 2/4. 2 divided by 4, that's 0.5. This looks familiar. It should look really familiar. 2/4 is equivalent to 1/2. And so we've seen this value before. Do you remember its equivalent fraction whose denominator equals 100? It's 50/100ths, or 50%. Nice job. Now let's divide 3 by 4. You get 0 and 75/100ths. If we're still thinking about money, do you see that 1/4 is 25 cents? 2/4 is 50 cents. 3/4, 75 cents. I like these patterns. Let's look at some of the equivalent fractions. If you need to, pause this video and do the division. Convince yourself that they are all equivalent to 75/100ths. And there's our percentage, 75%. I love the fourths, and I love thinking about money. Let's go on. Now let's talk about the fifths. I'm just going to list a couple here because I think you should be catching on to some patterns. Let's do 1/5 first. When you divide, you should get 2/10. And now let's look at some other equivalent fractions who will also be equivalent to 2/10. If I keep making equivalent fractions, I can make one whose denominator is 100, and it would be 20/100ths, equivalent to 20%. Can you guess the values for 2/5? I'll show them quickly, but feel free to pause if you need to. Were you right? How about 3/5? Do you see a pattern? Can you guess what 4/5 would be equivalent to? You're right, 80%. Okay, I think we've gone through all the basic benchmark fractions, but think about this. Think about the fractions that I'm showing in the box. Why are the tenths the easiest fractions to understand? And what are the decimal equivalents for each? What are the equivalent fractions for each? And how do the percentages relate to one another? Write down your results and pause this video. That's the end of this video, boys and girls. Now I think it's time to go grab a snack and practice your benchmark fractions. As you'll see in class tomorrow, we're going to use them to make our lives much easier. Until tomorrow, bye-bye.